The fastest way to embarrass yourself in a military briefing is to laugh at the wrong person. The conference room at Camp Ridgeline fell quiet as officers settled into their seats for the morning operational review. Screens glowed along the walls, displaying maps, logistics reports, and training schedules for the coming month. Marine Captain Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest voice in the room. Around him sat platoon leaders, operations staff, and visiting personnel from several commands. Near the far end of the table, a woman entered carrying a thin folder and a tablet. She looked unremarkable at first glance. Evelyn Carter wore a simple, dark uniform with no decorations that drew attention. Her brown hair was tied neatly behind her head, and her expression remained calm as she took the last available seat. Several officers barely noticed her arrival. Mercer did. He glanced at the nameplate placed in front of her and smirked. "Well, this should be interesting," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. A few heads turned. "Looks like they finally decided to send us somebody with a rank we can all aspire to." A couple of younger officers chuckled. Evelyn looked up briefly but said nothing. Mercer continued, "No offense, ma'am. I'm sure that title impresses somebody." More laughter followed. It was the kind of harmless public teasing that often filled military rooms before serious discussions began. Most people expected Evelyn to react, defend herself, or at least force a smile. Instead, she quietly opened her folder and reviewed the documents inside. That only encouraged Mercer. "I've got to admit," he said, tapping the table, "I've seen some creative staffing decisions, but this one might be my favorite." The room laughed again. Evelyn remained silent. The briefing officially began. A major stepped forward and started outlining a large-scale training exercise scheduled for later that week. As the presentation continued, officers exchanged opinions and debated logistics. Mercer spoke often. Evelyn never interrupted. Yet several times her eyes moved across the screens with unusual focus, lingering on details most people ignored. Distances, supply routes, timing windows, communication overlaps. She studied each slide with the concentration of someone reviewing something far more important than a routine exercise. 40 minutes into the meeting, the major displayed a final operational map. Mercer nodded approvingly. "Looks solid." Several officers agreed. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Her gaze settled on a highlighted route crossing a remote section of terrain. For the first time all morning, she raised her hand. The room grew unexpectedly still. "There may be a problem with that route," she said calmly. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried clearly across the room. Mercer laughed immediately. "And here I was worried we'd finish the briefing without hearing from our distinguished guest." More laughter followed. Evelyn simply looked at the map. "I believe the timing assumptions are incorrect." Mercer leaned forward, smiling. "Well then," he said, "this ought to be good." Evelyn did not look at Captain Mercer when the laughter faded. Her attention remained fixed on the map displayed across the main screen. The highlighted route stretched through a narrow training corridor in the western sector of the base's operational zone. Most people saw a clean line connecting checkpoints. Evelyn saw something else entirely. She studied the timing markers for several seconds before speaking again. "The projected travel window assumes uninterrupted movement at 30 miles per hour," she said calmly. "That assumption will not hold." Mercer folded his arms. "And why exactly is that?" The challenge in his voice was obvious. Evelyn tapped a point on the screen using the digital display controls at her seat. "Because this section was reclassified 6 months ago." A few officers exchanged glances. The major leading the briefing frowned. "No, it was not." Evelyn nodded slightly. "The terrain assessment changed after the communications upgrade project." The major quickly opened another file on his tablet. His confidence faded almost immediately. "That project was completed last fall," he admitted. "Correct," Evelyn replied. "The maintenance convoys reduced average movement speeds through that corridor by nearly 40% during scheduled operations." The room became noticeably quieter. Mercer still looked unconvinced. "Even if that is true, it changes very little." Evelyn did not argue. She simply pressed another command. A secondary map appeared beside the first. Several officers leaned forward. The difference was immediately obvious. Supply vehicles, training units, and communications teams were all scheduled to occupy overlapping sections of the route at nearly the same time. What had looked efficient on the original briefing now appeared crowded and vulnerable to delays. A 4-minute delay at checkpoint 3 becomes 11 minutes by checkpoint 6, Evelyn explained. Then 17 minutes by the final objective. The major stared at the numbers. He ran the calculation again on his tablet. The result matched hers exactly. Mercer shifted in his chair. For the first time that morning, he did not have an immediate response. Evelyn continued speaking in the same steady tone. The exercise will still succeed. The timeline simply needs adjustment. Nobody laughed now. A lieutenant near the back raised his hand. How did you catch that so quickly? Evelyn paused. I review patterns. It was not really an answer, but it was all she offered. The major cleared his throat. She is right. The statement landed heavily in the room. Mercer glanced around and noticed that several officers were now looking at Evelyn differently. Not with admiration. Not yet. But certainly with curiosity. The captain forced a smile. Congratulations, he said. You found a scheduling problem. A few polite chuckles followed, though far fewer than before. Evelyn gave a small nod and returned to her notes. She seemed completely uninterested in proving anything. That unsettled Mercer more than if she had argued. Across the table, an older colonel who had remained silent throughout the meeting studied Evelyn carefully. His eyes narrowed for just a moment, as though something about her seemed familiar. He looked at her nameplate again. Then he looked a second time. The expression on his face changed almost imperceptibly. He did not speak. He simply continued watching while the briefing moved forward. And for the first time that morning, someone else in the room appeared to know that Evelyn Carter was not who everyone assumed she was. The briefing should have returned to normal after the route correction, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Conversations that had once flowed easily now carried an undercurrent of caution. Officers who had ignored Evelyn earlier occasionally glanced in her direction before speaking. She seemed unaware of it, or perhaps she simply did not care. The major moved on to the next phase of the exercise, bringing up a series of deployment schedules and communication assignments. Captain Mercer regained some of his confidence as the discussion shifted back into familiar territory. He spoke often, offering recommendations and adjustments that several people supported. For a while, the meeting appeared to settle into a routine rhythm. Then another map appeared on the main screen. This one showed command coordination points spread across nearly 200 square miles of training area. Evelyn studied it quietly. Her eyes moved across the display, stopping briefly at a remote communications relay station marked near the northern boundary. She looked at it for several seconds before lowering her gaze to her notes. The older colonel noticed. He had been watching her for most of the meeting now. Not openly, just enough to confirm a growing suspicion. Across the table, Mercer finished outlining a proposed command structure and leaned back with obvious satisfaction. That should cover every scenario we are likely to encounter, he said. Several officers nodded. Evelyn closed her folder. The sound was soft, but somehow it drew attention. Mercer noticed immediately. Please do not tell me there is another disaster hiding in the paperwork. A few people laughed nervously. Evelyn remained calm. Not a disaster. Mercer smiled. Good. We are making progress. She looked toward the screen. Just an assumption. The room quieted again. Mercer sighed dramatically. Of course it is. Evelyn pointed toward the northern relay station. If that relay goes offline during peak traffic, communications will bottleneck through the secondary network. A lieutenant frowned. That relay has never failed. Evelyn nodded. Correct. Then why would it fail now? Another officer asked. Evelyn answered without hesitation. Because it is scheduled for maintenance during the same operational window. The lieutenant quickly checked his tablet. His expression changed almost instantly. She is right. The room fell silent. Mercer looked annoyed. Maintenance does not mean failure. No, Evelyn agreed. It means reduced capacity, which creates the same result. The lieutenant continued reviewing records. The maintenance order was approved 3 weeks ago. Several officers began pulling up supporting documents. One by one, they reached the same conclusion. The conflict had been hidden inside separate departments. Nobody had connected the schedules. Nobody except Evelyn. Mercer stared at the screen. How are you finding these things? Evelyn considered the question for a moment. Someone has to look at the whole picture. The answer lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. At the far end of the table, the colonel slowly opened a secure personnel directory on his tablet. He entered a name. Evelyn Carter. Several restricted notices appeared immediately. His eyes narrowed. Then a security banner appeared across the screen. Access limited. Additional authorization required. The colonel sat perfectly still. He had served for nearly 30 years. Very few personnel files had ever responded that way. He looked up from the tablet and studied Evelyn again. This time, there was no doubt in his expression. He knew he had seen something important. He simply had not figured out what it was yet. The meeting continued, but the balance inside the room had shifted in ways most people had not yet recognized. Captain Mercer felt it more than anyone. Twice now, Evelyn had identified problems that experienced officers had overlooked. Twice now, the room had watched her quietly prove her point without raising her voice. Mercer disliked the growing attention she was receiving. He told himself it was because the officers were overreacting. Everyone found mistakes eventually. That did not make someone exceptional. The major moved to the final segment of the briefing and displayed the chain of authority assigned to the exercise. Names, positions, and reporting responsibilities appeared across the screen. Mercer leaned forward and immediately resumed speaking with confidence. This was familiar territory. Command structures, leadership assignments, decisions that carried weight. He pointed toward one section and recommended several adjustments. Most of the room agreed. Then his eyes landed on a line near the bottom of the chart. Evelyn's name appeared there beside a temporary advisory designation. Mercer laughed. Not loudly this time, but enough for everyone to hear. There it is again, he said. The famous title. Several officers looked uncomfortable. Mercer ignored them. I have to admit, whoever came up with that rank did not do her any favors. A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Evelyn remained focused on her notes. She neither looked up nor responded. Mercer continued. You know, in the Marines we usually expect people to earn authority before they start correcting operational plans. The comment hung in the air. The major shifted awkwardly. Nobody joined the laughter this time. Evelyn slowly closed her notebook. Authority and accuracy are not the same thing, Captain. The answer was calm and respectful. That only seemed to irritate Mercer more. Maybe not, he replied. But authority matters. Evelyn gave a slight nod. Sometimes. The room fell silent. Mercer leaned back. Sometimes. Evelyn looked toward the command chart. The plan does not care who identifies a problem. The plan only cares whether the problem exists. No one spoke. The statement was simple, difficult to argue with. Across the table, the colonel opened another secure database. He entered additional credentials and waited. This time, a warning message appeared before the file even loaded. Restricted access. Authorization review required. The colonel stared at the screen. Beneath the warning sat several archived references connected to Evelyn Carter. Most were unavailable. Every attempt to open them generated another layer of security restrictions. The colonel had encountered classified records before. He had never encountered a personnel file structured like this. Slowly, he looked up. Evelyn sat quietly while the discussion moved around her. She showed no sign of concern, no sign of pride, no sign that she even realized someone was investigating her background. The colonel's pulse quickened slightly. Whatever this woman had done in the past, it was important enough that entire sections of her record remained hidden from senior officers. Mercer, unaware of any of this, shook his head and pointed toward Evelyn's designation on the chart again. With all due respect, I still find it hard to believe that title carries much weight anywhere. The colonel's eyes narrowed. For the first time all morning, he considered speaking. Then he stopped himself. Not yet. He needed answers first. And somewhere behind multiple layers of locked records, answers were waiting. The briefing reached what should have been its final minutes. Yet almost nobody was paying attention to the presentation anymore. An invisible tension had settled across the room. Officers who had arrived expecting a routine planning session now found themselves watching two entirely different stories unfold. One was displayed on the screens. The other was sitting quietly at the end of the table. Colonel Nathan Brooks lowered his tablet and stared at the secure warning messages that still covered the personnel file. He had entered every authorization available to him. The system continued refusing access. That alone was remarkable. Then another notification appeared. Request requires special review authority. Brooks read it twice. During 3 decades of service, he had seen aircraft records, intelligence records, and mission archives protected at high levels. He had never seen a simple personnel file guarded this aggressively. Across the room, Captain Mercer was still speaking. I think we are making this far more complicated than necessary, he said. The exercise works. The chain of command is clear. Everybody knows their role. Evelyn listened without expression. Brooks looked at her again. The calmness bothered him more than any hidden file. Most people under scrutiny became defensive. Most people tried to prove themselves. Evelyn seemed completely indifferent to what others thought. It was the confidence of someone who no longer needed validation. Brooks opened a secure messaging portal and sent a brief inquiry to a contact at Regional Command. He expected a response sometime later that afternoon. Instead, his tablet vibrated less than 60 seconds later. His contact had answered immediately. The message contained only 6 words. Do not discuss that file openly. Brooks felt his stomach tighten. He read the sentence again. Then he checked the sender to ensure it was authentic. It was. A second message appeared. Requesting access will trigger review. Brooks slowly locked the screen and sat back. For the first time all day, he understood that whatever was hidden behind Evelyn Carter's record extended well beyond a forgotten assignment or a classified deployment. Someone, somewhere, actively monitored access to her history. Meanwhile, the meeting continued. Mercer pointed toward the organizational chart once again. At the end of the day, rank exists for a reason, he said. People earn responsibility through position. Several officers avoided eye contact. The earlier confidence in the room had disappeared. Evelyn finally looked up. Sometimes responsibility comes before position, she said quietly. The statement was simple, but it carried a strange weight. Mercer shook his head. That sounds nice, but that is not how the military works. Evelyn did not argue. She simply returned to her notes. Brooks noticed something then. Near the corner of her folder sat a small identification badge. Most of it was covered by paperwork, but one section remained visible. A code, not a rank, not a title, just a short sequence of letters and numbers. Brooks felt a jolt of recognition. He had seen a similar format years ago during a briefing that had taken place behind closed doors. A briefing that most officers were never invited to attend. His eyes widened slightly. Before he could examine it more closely, Evelyn closed the folder. The badge disappeared from view. At that exact moment, Brooks' tablet vibrated again. Another secure message had arrived. This one was marked priority. He opened it and immediately felt the color leave his face. The message contained a single instruction. Verify identity immediately. No further explanation was provided. Colonel Brooks stared at the priority message for several long seconds before locking the screen. The noise of the room seemed distant now. Conversations continued around him. Charts remained projected on the wall, and officers exchanged opinions about schedules and resources, but his attention was fixed entirely on the woman sitting across the table. Verify identity immediately. The instruction had come from a source that never sent unnecessary messages. Brooks took a slow breath and stood. The movement drew attention. The room gradually quieted. Even Captain Mercer stopped talking. Brooks looked toward Evelyn. Ms. Carter, he said carefully, may I ask you a question? Evelyn lifted her eyes from her notes. Of course, Colonel. Brooks hesitated. He was choosing each word with unusual care. Have you previously served under any special operational authority that would affect access to your personnel records? Several officers exchanged confused looks. Mercer frowned. The question seemed strangely specific. Evelyn remained calm. Yes. The answer arrived without hesitation. Brooks nodded slowly. Would that authority still be active? A faint silence settled over the room. Evelyn considered the question. Certain parts of it, she replied. Mercer laughed once, though the sound lacked confidence. What exactly does that mean? Evelyn turned toward him. It means some records remain restricted. Mercer leaned back in his chair. Everybody has restricted records. Brooks immediately spoke. No, Captain. Not like this. The room became completely still. Several officers looked toward the colonel. His expression had changed. The casual patience he had shown throughout the meeting was gone. In its place stood something closer to professional caution. Brooks unlocked his tablet again and entered a final authorization request. This time the response came instantly. A secure verification window appeared across the screen. He entered the identification sequence he had noticed earlier on Evelyn's badge. The system processed for several seconds. Then every color on the display shifted. A dark banner appeared across the top of the screen. Special access confirmed. Additional rank information restricted. Brooks felt his pulse quicken. The room watched in silence. Mercer frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Brooks did not answer immediately. His eyes continued moving across the limited information now available to him. Most sections remained hidden. Entire assignments were sealed. Dates existed without locations. Commands existed without descriptions. Yet one detail stood visible. One detail that changed everything. Brooks slowly lowered the tablet. "Captain," he said quietly. "The designation listed on the chart is not her actual standing." Mercer smiled. "Then what is?" Brooks looked directly at Evelyn before speaking. "Her operational authority exceeds everyone currently sitting in this room." No one moved. No one spoke. Mercer stared at him as though he had misheard. "That is impossible." Brooks shook his head. "I thought so too." The captain looked toward Evelyn. For the first time all day, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Evelyn offered no explanation. She did not correct anyone. She did not defend herself. She simply sat there with the same calm expression she had carried since the meeting began. And somehow that silence carried more weight than any rank insignia ever could. No one spoke for several seconds after Colonel Brooks lowered the tablet. The silence felt heavier than any argument that had taken place that morning. Captain Mercer looked from Brooks to Evelyn and back again, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. He found none. Evelyn remained exactly as she had been when the meeting began. Calm, composed, uninterested in defending herself. Finally, Mercer cleared his throat. "Operational authority over everyone in this room?" he asked. "That cannot be right." Colonel Brooks met his gaze. "The system confirmed it." "Then what exactly was her role?" Mercer pressed. Brooks hesitated. "Most of that information remains restricted." The answer only deepened the mystery. Around the table, officers exchanged uncertain looks. The briefing had stopped entirely. Nobody cared about schedules anymore. They wanted answers. One lieutenant spoke carefully. "Ma'am, if you do not mind me asking, what kind of assignment requires that level of restriction?" Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Unlike Mercer, the lieutenant sounded genuinely curious. "The kind where recognition is not part of the job," she replied. The room fell quiet again. Brooks slowly nodded. Something about that answer matched the fragments he had managed to see. Assignments without locations. Responsibilities without public records. Entire years hidden behind authorization barriers. "How long?" Brooks asked softly. Evelyn understood the question immediately. "A little over 11 years." Several officers stared. 11 years was a career, not a temporary assignment. Mercer looked down at the command chart still displayed on the screen. The title he had mocked earlier suddenly seemed meaningless. "And after all that," he said, "you chose to sit in this room without saying a word?" Evelyn folded her hands. Nobody asked. A few officers lowered their eyes. The simplicity of the answer carried its own lesson. She had never hidden anything. She had simply never volunteered it. Brooks leaned back in his chair and allowed an old memory to surface. More than a decade earlier, he had attended a closed briefing at another installation. A senior commander had spoken about a specialized program that almost never appeared in official reports. The people selected for it were expected to solve problems, coordinate missions, and guide decisions at levels far above their visible rank. Success meant nobody knew their names. Failure meant everyone noticed. Brooks remembered one sentence from that briefing more clearly than anything else. "The best leaders are often the ones you never realize are leading." His eyes returned to Evelyn. For the first time, pieces began fitting together. Her ability to spot flaws instantly. Her refusal to seek credit. Her complete indifference to status. None of it was accidental. It was training. Years of it. Mercer seemed to reach a similar conclusion. The confidence that had defined him all morning had faded. "You could have corrected me hours ago," he said quietly. Evelyn offered a faint smile. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered. Because everyone in the room knew the truth. If she had revealed her background at the start, they would have listened because of her authority. Instead, she had earned their attention through competence alone. And somehow that made the lesson impossible to ignore. For several moments, nobody spoke. The conference room that had been filled with confident opinions all morning now felt unusually small. Captain Mercer looked at the maps on the screen, then at the notebook in front of him, then finally at Evelyn. The certainty that had fueled every joke and every challenge had disappeared. In its place was something far less comfortable. Reflection. The major quietly cleared the command chart from the display and replaced it with the operational plan again. No one objected. No one seemed interested in discussing titles anymore. Colonel Brooks folded his hands and looked around the table. "We still have an exercise to prepare," he said calmly. "Let us focus on that." Several officers nodded immediately. The tone of the room had changed. When the discussion resumed, people no longer rushed to defend their ideas. They listened more carefully. Questions replaced assumptions. Details that had once been dismissed received proper attention. And each time a new issue appeared, eyes drifted toward Evelyn almost automatically. She never took control of the room. She never acted like the most important person present. She simply answered when asked. A logistics officer requested her opinion regarding transportation timing. She offered a recommendation. A communications specialist asked about network redundancy. She identified a vulnerability and suggested an adjustment. Each answer was concise, practical, free of ego. The more she spoke, the more remarkable her restraint became. Captain Mercer noticed it too. He had spent years around leaders who felt compelled to remind everyone of their accomplishments. Evelyn never mentioned hers. Not once. Eventually Mercer leaned forward. "Can I ask something?" Evelyn looked toward him. "Of course." He hesitated before continuing. "When you pointed out those problems earlier, were you already aware of who you were sitting with?" A few officers exchanged curious glances. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I reviewed the attendee list before arriving." Mercer almost laughed at the answer. "Then you knew exactly who I was?" "Yes." "And you still sat there while I made assumptions about you?" "Yes." Mercer shook his head slowly. "Why?" The room became quiet again. Evelyn considered the question. "Because people usually reveal themselves long before they reveal what they know." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even Colonel Brooks remained silent. Evelyn continued in the same calm voice. "The first thing a person notices tells you what matters to them. Some people notice rank. Some notice experience. Some notice competence. It is useful information." Mercer lowered his eyes. There was no accusation in her words. No attempt to embarrass him. Somehow that made them even harder to ignore. A young lieutenant near the back finally spoke. "So what should we have noticed?" Evelyn glanced toward the maps displayed across the wall. "The work." Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. A different kind. The kind that appears when everyone in a room understands the lesson at exactly the same moment. Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon sun had begun to shift across the base. Inside, the meeting moved forward once more. But no one present would ever experience it the same way again. The meeting finally came to an end nearly 2 hours later than scheduled. One by one, officers gathered their tablets, folders, and notes. Yet nobody rushed for the door. The atmosphere inside the room felt different now, as if everyone understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than a routine briefing. Colonel Brooks remained seated for a moment, watching Evelyn organize her papers with the same quiet precision she had shown all day. There was no celebration in her expression, no satisfaction, no sign that she viewed the morning as some kind of victory. To her, it had simply been another day of work. Captain Mercer stood slowly. For several seconds he appeared uncertain. Then he walked around the table and stopped beside Evelyn's chair. Conversations immediately faded. Every officer in the room noticed. Mercer took a breath. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked up. "That is not necessary." "It is," Mercer replied. "I made assumptions before I knew anything about you." The room remained silent. Evelyn studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. "Then learn from it." There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Only honesty. Mercer managed a faint smile. "I intend to." Across the room, a young lieutenant carefully closed his notebook. Earlier that morning, he had laughed along with the jokes. Now he found himself writing down a single sentence before leaving. "Notice the work." Brooks noticed it and smiled to himself. Some lessons stayed with people longer than any official training ever could. As officers gradually departed, several stopped to thank Evelyn for her recommendations. Others asked brief questions about planning methods and risk assessment. She answered each one politely. Then, as quickly as the attention had arrived, she stepped away from it. Within minutes, she was gathering her belongings and preparing to leave. Brooks approached before she reached the door. "I suspect there is a great deal I still do not know," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "There usually is." Brooks nodded. "Will we see you again?" "Probably." "Good." For a moment neither spoke. Then Brooks extended his hand. Evelyn shook it. No ceremony. No announcement. No audience. Just mutual respect. She turned and walked toward the exit. The door closed quietly behind her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Finally, Mercer looked toward the maps still displayed on the wall. The plans were better now. The exercise would run more smoothly. The mistakes had been corrected. Yet somehow those were not the things he would remember most. What stayed with him was the realization that true authority had entered the room without demanding recognition. It had spoken softly. It had listened carefully. And it had proven itself through actions rather than titles. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across Camp Ridgeline as Evelyn Carter crossed the parking area and disappeared into the flow of daily activity. Most people passing by would never know who she was. They would see only another professional heading to her next assignment. And that was exactly how she preferred it. Because the strongest people rarely spend time convincing others of their worth. They focus on the work, let results speak for themselves, and move forward without needing applause. Respect, after all, is not something demanded. It is something earned in silence.